This is United States History to 1877, Chapter 14, The Civil War. In this presentation, you will learn the following information. 1. The Confederate States broke away because they wanted to continue the practice of slavery. 2. Abraham Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union, but later made the Civil War about ending slavery. 3. The Civil War was harder than anyone anticipated. 4. The North had a plan for the Civil War. It was to surround the South and to force them to surrender. 5. The North destroyed the South using a new form of warfare called total war. The American Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history, resulting in approximately 750,000 deaths. Northern soldiers went to war to preserve the Union, but the war was ultimately transformed by Abraham Lincoln into a fight to end slavery. The Civil War was a defining event in the history of the United States, one that is still influencing the nation over 150 years after it ended. The election of 1860 was chaotic. Abraham Lincoln won all the free states except for New Jersey and won only 40% of the popular vote. All the future Confederate states had left Lincoln's name off the ballot. The election of Lincoln and the threat he represented to Southerners and slavery, at least in the minds of Southerners, moved all of the Southern states to ultimately secede from the Union. For the 7 original Confederate states, slavery was named as essential in their founding documents. These 7 breakaway states elected Jefferson Davis as their president. The attack on Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April of 1861 saw the South initiate the first violence of the war, and President Lincoln responded, calling for 75,000 volunteers from the North to put down the rebellion. The Civil War had begun. The assault on Fort Sumter and the call for troops led the Upper South to secede and join the Confederacy. In total, 11 states renounced their allegiance to the United States. The defense of slavery was central to the Confederacy, even as some would argue it was a question of states' rights. But in order to protect slavery, the new Confederate Constitution gave even less power to the new Confederate states than they had enjoyed under the United States Constitution, an obvious contradiction that revealed the primacy of slavery over the argument of states' rights. Abraham Lincoln's plan to win the war was known as the Anaconda Plan, a strategy intended to strangle the Confederacy by cutting off access to coastal ports and inland waterways using a naval blockade. Black Americans had put forward the issue of slavery as a cause for the war, even as Abraham Lincoln argued to make the war limited to preserving the Union. Black Americans wanted to serve in the Army and the Navy, but Abraham Lincoln feared their service might weaken the loyalty of border states. Border states like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland maintained their loyalty to the Union during the war, but also maintained slavery as part of their state's This balance between slavery and fighting for the Union made Lincoln slow to declare emancipation of slaves as the main cause for the war. During the earliest days of the war, Union forces liberated runaway slaves as contraband, taking them as they might take a gun or a cannon from the enemy, denying its use against the Union Army. This avoided the slavery question, at least for a time. Fugitive slaves were not officially to be helped by Union forces, but they often were. Every slave who escaped to the Union's control was a loss to the Confederate war effort. The first battle of the Civil War was at Bull Run, a small field outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia, in an area known as Manassas. A surprise Confederate victory sent a message to the North that the war would be harder than anyone imagined. While the war dragged on into uncertainty, very definite actions were taken in Congress, now dominated by Northern representation, known as Radical Republicans. Radical Republicans passed laws defining lands in the West, authorizing a new national cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, and the Transcontinental Railroad. New banks were chartered, and new powers were created to help the federal government and big business to develop the economy during the war. On the battlefield, Abraham Lincoln had named George McClellan as his new lead general. McClellan tried to surround Richmond, Virginia, the new capital of the Confederacy. At the Battle of Shiloh on April 6th and 7th of 1862, 23,000 casualties were taken, more than in all previous U.S. wars combined. By 1862, Black Americans were pushing for full emancipation for slaves. Congress passed the Confiscation Act in April of 1862, outlawing slavery in Washington, D.C. Abraham Lincoln had been advised to wait for a battlefield victory before announcing full emancipation for the slaves. This was a perilous moment for the new president, who did not want to upset the balance between slave and free states who were still loyal to the Union, but desperately needed something to fight the war around. The Battle of Antietam was that victory for Abraham Lincoln. Antietam remains the single bloodiest day in American history, with over 20,000 Americans killed. While Antietam was not a decisive victory, it was enough for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which did not free all slaves, but just slaves in areas under Confederate control. The Emancipation Proclamation gave Abraham Lincoln the legal authority to emancipate the slaves without using the regular legal process. In his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces during a time of insurrection, Lincoln argued he could emancipate the slaves as a necessary part of the war effort. As Union armies penetrated deeper into Confederate territory, African Americans were allowed greater and greater participation in the campaign. Widespread enlistment did not occur until after the Emancipation Proclamation. Black soldiers faced rampant discrimination and received lower pay than white soldiers. The majority of African Americans in the Army had at one time been enslaved, but in uniform they represented liberation and the destruction of slavery. Black troops fought in over 400 battles in the Civil War, serving honorably and sacrificing their life, while in many cases liberating friends and family from slavery in the South. Sadly, Confederates did not consider black soldiers as deserving the respect due to the uniform, and when captured were not treated as white prisoners of war. Confederate General Robert E. Lee gambled and invaded Pennsylvania in 1863. This offensive into Northern Territory was a first for the Confederates, who up until this point had fought a mostly defensive and successful fight against the Union armies. A 3-day battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, crippled Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the war, and the bloodiest in American history, with 50,000 casualties. Despite Union victories at Chancellorsville and at Vicksburg in 1863, discontent over the war simmered across the northern states. A draft had been issued for the first time in American history, forcing Northerners to fight. Working-class Northerners were angry that the wealthy could pay $300 for a substitute to take their place, sparing them the need to fight. In New York City, draft riots broke out, which saw white rioters kill 120 people, including the lynching of 11 black New Yorkers. In the South, similar riots broke out against the war because of food shortages that had led to bread riots in several Confederate cities. The tactics of the war changed in 1864. Grant and the Union Army began to wage total war, targeting civilians and property for the first time. William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Tennessee and Georgia, capturing and burning Atlanta, the largest city in the South. On Election Day in 1864, Abraham Lincoln defeated his former general George McClellan 55 to 49% in the popular vote. In the Electoral College, Abraham Lincoln won 212 electors to George McClellan's 21. Abraham Lincoln also won 22 states to McClellan's 3. The Southern states did not obviously participate in the election of 1864. At his second inauguration, Abraham Lincoln addressed the end of the war. He said the following: "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve to cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." In this second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln can see the war coming to an end and is imagining the next step of healing the nation's wounds and preparing the country for reunification. To ensure the permanent end of slavery, Republicans drafted the 13th Amendment. Despite this achievement, the end of slavery did not mean the end of racial injustice in America. After the war, Reconstruction of the South and the experience of new rights for African Americans was met with white racism and white violence. The effects of slavery endured long after emancipation. The Civil War created more questions than answers. Southerners had land but no workers. African Americans had freedom but no resources, homes, or education. the freedom gained was constantly threatened with violence. The war may have been over, but the battle for the peace had just begun. In this presentation, we learned the following information. 1. The Confederate States broke away because they wanted to continue the practice of slavery. 2. Abraham Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union, but later made the war about ending slavery. 3. The war was harder than anyone anticipated. 4. The North had a plan for the war to surround the South and force them to surrender. And 5. The North destroyed the South using a new form of warfare called total war. This has been United States History to 1877, Chapter 14, The Civil War. It was created with work from the American Yawp, an open-source U.S. history textbook published by Stanford University and edited by Joseph Locke and Ben Wright, with narration and commentary by myself, Tyler Rust, for History Dojo. For more information, articles, ebooks, and videos about history, as well as this course, please go to historydojo.blog.